Hello again everyone from Tokyo, Japan, and welcome back to Japan Vintage Camera, where today I'm going to be holding what I call the Battle of the Cheapies, which is a comparison video comparing the two most popular and inexpensive 35mm SLR cameras produced probably in the 20th century. One being the Canon AE-1 and the other one being the Olympus OM-10. Now, there were millions of these cameras produced during their production life, and when I was, back in the late 70s, early 80s, you saw these cameras everywhere. You saw, tourists carrying them. You saw them at sporting events. You saw them at school graduations. They were just a very important part of recording. I guess the times of the late 70s and early 80s, and some people are using these cameras even today. And today, of course, they are quite a great value since many millions of these were made. They're all over the place, and they're rather inexpensive. And they're really good cameras if you happen to come across one which is in decent condition. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the more popular of the two cameras, and that, of course, is the Canon AE-1. And AE-1 is a really wonderful camera, probably one of the most, the camera which I saw the most of when I was young. My friend Tony, his mother bought one of these cameras and she really loved it. And I remember going to watch him play in football games and things like that, and her taking photographs with her AE-1. She really loved the camera, and there were a lot of photos on the fireplace and mantle of him at his sporting events taken with her camera. These cameras they weren't cheap in the late 1970s, but they weren't anywhere near as expensive as the more professional models. They cost about less than half what an F1 or in the case of Olympus the later OM series cameras cost, but they featured the same lenses which were fitted on the more expensive cameras. So despite their lower cost, they were actually capable of taking pictures every bit as good as their more expensive brethren. The big difference between the cameras is that in those days, professionals tended to prefer a camera which could be used anywhere and everywhere in remote locations and in ridiculous conditions. And so usually they preferred a camera which had a mechanical operating system, or at least could be operated partially mechanically. So if the battery died or it got frozen or you couldn't find a replacement battery, you could still take photographs with the camera. People living in the cities and suburbs, of course, didn't have face the same kind of environmental situations as professional photographers, and you could buy batteries pretty much anywhere in those places. So it wasn't necessary to build that kind of precision mechanical machine. And of course, amateur photographers or consumers didn't require things like interchangeable finders on the camera, or high-powered motor drives, or highly technical data backs to be attached. They basically just needed a camera which was easy to use and took good photographs. And that's what the Canon AE-1 did. Now, the Canon AE-1 also has the distinction of being the first camera to feature a microprocessor or computer chip. Of course, it wasn't the first electronically controlled cameras, but the ones before that were much more simple, using a combination of mechanical, an electronic light meter which mechanically controlled the operation of the camera, or things like the transistor system, which Yashica called the computer brain of their Electro 35 series. The Canon AE-1 was a much more advanced camera, and of course paved the way to computer-controlled cameras in the future. Now, that said, there are a few issues which you have to be careful of when you are looking at the Canon AE-1. The first issue is the mirror issues with these cameras. The one issue which many of them have, if not most of them, is what is called the mirror squeak. And when the mirror moves up and down, it makes kind of a squeaking sound. And some people can notice it, some people don't notice it. The squeak itself doesn't have any effect on the operation of the camera. But cameras with the squeak, if you're trying to buy one or sell one, they'll be less expensive than cameras which don't have it. The squeak can be fixed, but it requires a little bit of disassembly of the camera and reaching with a modified syringe to put the oil on the appropriate place where it's squeaking. These cameras weren't designed really to be maintained. They were inexpensive enough to, they were designed to last, maybe a decade or so, and then to be replaced by the next new thing which came along. So these aren't exactly the easiest cameras to take apart and maintain. Canon made these cameras inexpensive by getting rid of a lot of the electronic parts and other things, and greatly reducing the parts count. And there were hundreds less parts in one of these cameras than say something like the FTB or the earlier electronically controlled EF. It's a really good camera if you can get it without the shutter squeak issue or without, sometimes the mirror sticks in these cameras. And this camera here has the issue with the sticking mirror, so I'm going to take it apart and see if I can't figure out what's going on and get that fixed and get this one working again. Another issue, it can be fungus between the viewfinder and the prism, and that's really difficult to remove on these because to remove the top cover and to get access or to remove the prism, you have to unsolder this kind of plastic flexible circuit thing on the top. And it's very hard. It's easy to unsolder and remove, but it's hard to do it without damaging it. So basically, if you're buying one of these cameras, try to get one which has a clean focusing screen, looks clear through the viewfinder, and doesn't have a squeaky or stuck mirror. The control system on this camera was what was one of the major selling points because it featured automatic operation, which made it very easy to use. Basically, this was a shutter priority camera, and Canon really had a thing for shutter priority. A lot of their automatic cameras in those days featured shutter priority, and what that meant is you set the camera to the shutter speed which you prefer, and the camera would automatically set the aperture. And this is really good for preventing blur in your photographs because you can choose the minimum shutter speed. Canon recommends not shooting it below 1/60th of a second because you're more likely to get blur at those speeds. For myself, I tend to shoot usually around, I like to shoot, 400 speed film. It's like f8 aperture, and that would give me a shutter speed, depending on how much light there is, between 1/60th and 1/250th of a second. So 1/25th would probably be what I would use if I were, shooting ASA 400 speed film. But it depends on what film you're using and what kind of effect you're trying to get. If you shoot at the faster shutter speeds, that will freeze the action, but you will get a larger aperture, which reduces depth of field. So it's kind of a hit and miss thing. What you want to do is you want to get the best balance of aperture and shutter speed for the type of photograph you're trying to take. Another cool thing about this camera was the electronic self-timer. So you push the button and you can see the LED light flashing there. And this was a really new feature, really cool on the Canon cameras, and made them very popular for taking, the selfies of those days. And the light faces upward, but you can see it from the side. There's a little bit of a cutout. Another cool thing about this camera is that you can easily shut off the self-timer by just pushing the battery check button, and that's in case someone moves or something falls down or something like that. You won't waste a frame of film. You can stop the self timer. You can go ahead and pick up whatever fell down, or catch your dog or whatever it is you're trying to get in the photo, and then go ahead and start over again and get the shot. And of course, you can use this camera fully manual by simply switching over to the manual aperture settings and using the readout inside the viewfinder. It's a really wonderful camera. And another point, something I didn't mention, it uses a commonly available battery, a normal 4LR44 battery. So you don't have the battery issues in this camera like you might have in some of the earlier ones. And the FD mount is a really big plus because there were lots and lots of different FD lenses, from fisheyes and wide-angle lenses to super telephotos, and lots of stuff in between. And of course, there were third-party makers like Vivitar, Tamron, Sigma, and those who made lenses for these cameras. A really good camera with a good selection of lenses. If you hear some noise in the background, that's my dog. He's having a dream. He's sleeping over there next to the window. All right. Let's move over to the Olympus OM-10. And the Olympus OM-10 was, of course, the more consumer-oriented version of the OM series, which was released back in 1972. There was the OM single-digit series, the OM-1, OM-2, 3, and 4. And then, of course, the titanium versions. The double-digit series, the 10, 20, 30, 40, were the more consumer-oriented versions. And these were also quite popular sellers. And I remember watching advertisements for these cameras when I was a kid, and they featured supermodels and things like that. These weren't quite as popular as the Canon AE-1, but they were popular, and you find these OM-10 cameras pretty much everywhere. They're on eBay, they're in thrift stores, they're in pawn shops. They're hiding in closets and things like that, and and they're really inexpensive. And also, like the Canon AE-1, they feature the OM lens mount, and the OM lenses are very professional quality lenses. And as I said with the AE-1, the heart and soul of the camera is the lens. So you kind of choose the platform you want just to mount the lens, but basically, the image comes out on film, and the lens is what puts the image on the film. And the camera is just a light box which controls how much light goes onto the film for however long. Now, of course, the OM series cameras were not oriented toward professionals in the way that the Canon F1 was. They didn't feature the things like the removable prisms or things like that. But they were very good cameras for things like wedding photography, where you might carry 2 or 3 camera bodies and flashes, and 2 or 3 OM1s weigh about as much as one, say, Canon F1 with a motor drive and all of that. So I'll say 2, not 3. So they were professional quality cameras, but just with a little bit of a different take on what a professional camera should be. Now, this camera here is different from the AE-1 in that it features aperture priority automatic operation. And what that means is you select the aperture setting you like for the effect you're trying to get. So you can get a wide aperture for narrow depth of field, or a small aperture for deep depth of field and more detail. And the camera will automatically select the best shutter speed for that aperture. The one thing you have to be careful of is that when you start to move toward the smaller apertures, the shutter can begin to run really slow. And the slower it gets, the more difficult it is to avoid blur in your images. So you don't want to stop the camera down too much, say past f8 or so, unless you're using a tripod, or you've got a really steady hand, or leaned against a tree or post or something like that. The self-timer on this camera is an improvement over the AE-1. When you shoot it, not only do you get that flashing LED on the front, but you get an audible beep. And this is a pretty cool function. It allows you to see as well as hear, especially if the sun is shining on the camera and you can't see the LED. But unfortunately, you can't stop the self-timer in the middle of its countdown. It will, if you try to stop it by turning it off, the shutter will fire and it'll cost you a frame of film. So I give a point to the AE-1 for having a better idea for the self-timer system. The battery check system is quite simple. You turn it to the check, and if you can hear the tone, that means that the battery is good. We have a simple on-off switch here. Now, this camera offers, as I said, aperture priority automatic operation, whereas the Canon AE-1 offers either shutter priority or full manual operation. But you can get full manual operation with the Olympus OM-10 if you have that manual adapter, which is an accessory which clips on here and adds a small shutter speed dial to the front. Now, these are kind of a desirable option, and often these adapters sell for more than what the camera sells for by itself. Usually when I sell these cameras, I try to include a manual adapter with it. So, if people prefer to use the camera manually, they can just clip it on and then switch it to the manual setting, and they're good to go. We have a selector switch here, which allows you to switch. Normally you would set it to the auto setting, and on the back here, there's a button you can push to move it toward that manual adapter setting or to the bulb setting. So you can use this camera for taking timed exposures or astrophotography or stuff like that. And this camera, like the AE-1, I didn't mention it, but it has a regular conventional shutter release button which accepts a standard cable release. This particular OM-10 is the OM-10 Quartz. And of course, the quartz time controls were a big thing in the 1970s. They were a big selling feature for things like wristwatches and stuff like that. And on cameras, a quartz-controlled mechanism was more accurate than the mechanisms which came out before. And also, these cameras featured the quartz one featured a data back, which allowed you to imprint the date and time on the back of your photograph. And it's fun looking through the old picture albums and then looking at the day, and you can remember what day that the photograph was taken and what year it was. And it's kind of fun to look at those and kind of remember what life was like at the time the photographs were taken. The back door opens here and allows you to set the different functions here. The problem with these data backs in these cameras is they were dated from the 1970s and 80s, and they didn't expect these cameras to be used in the next century. So the years don't go up. But if you're willing to wait up until the 1970s, if you give these to your grandkids or great grandkids, they can still use that. They can set it, and then they'll be able to get more or less the correct date on the photograph. One good thing about the OM-10 compared to the AE-1 is that it's a little bit lighter and it's a little bit more compact, a little bit easier to carry around. I find that the shutter is actually a little bit smoother in the AE-1, but I think that's a little bit due to its extra weight and the larger lens on the front. Though the shutter feeling in the OM-10 feels really good, but it's not quite as soft as I think is the mechanical shutter in the OM-1. But most people who are going to use these cameras aren't going to really be interested in how the shutter feels. They're just interested in the kind of photographs the camera takes. So I hope I've explained or given you a little bit of information about these cameras, and hopefully you've learned a little bit. I explained a couple of the weaknesses, the mirror issues and such, and kind of the difficulty in maintenance in the AE-1 series. Weaknesses for the OM-10, there aren't many. Fortunately, it's a more reliable camera in my experience than the AE-1. It seldom suffers from the issues like the sticking mirrors or things like that. One issue which the OM-10 has is similar to what came in the earlier OM series, and that is a deterioration of the prism. And that is the foam rubber which protects the prism. It sits between the prism and the top cover. Over time, the chemicals break down and they get into the mirror coating on the prism and they cause black spots. And fortunately, this one here doesn't have any black spots in it, and this one's actually remarkably clean. So luckily, this is a nice clean example. Maybe half of them have the issues, at least here in Japan, where we have 4 seasons and people aren't very, they don't like to use the heater much in the winter and they don't like to use the air conditioning much in the summer. So cameras get frozen and hot and frozen and hot, and that causes issues with the deterioration. If you live in a more temperate place or keep, the climate controlled in your home a little bit better, you're not going to have these kind of issues. And look like this one was kept in that, stored better than what they usually are. But that's something to look out for. The prism is replaceable, though it's not exactly an easy task. But the work is actually a little bit easier than doing it on the Canon AE-1. Accessories for these, they say that you can't interchange the focusing screens in them, but I've often found that if you look closely, you usually find that you can remove the panel here. If you remove the, there are usually ways to do it. Where there's a will, there's a way, and I found that I've been able to fix problems with like the scratch focusing screens. You're finding a junk camera which has a good one, and popping out a couple of screws, retainer, and removing the scratch screen and putting a new one in. And also that allows you to like clean the underside of the prism if it has fungus on it without having to try to remove the top cover to get inside it. So but more reliable, a little bit less reliable, better self-timer, and less expensive lenses. More compact lenses, lighter weight, and a slightly smaller dimensions. So those are the main differences between these cameras. But anyway, this video is becoming quite long, getting close to 20 minutes now, so I'm going to go ahead and cut it short because I have other things to do. The AE-1 needs a fair amount of work, so I'm going to go ahead and see what I can do with it to get the mirror working again. This OM-10 is in quite good condition. Everything works on it fine, so I'll be listing this for sale in my online store shortly. So if you'd want to buy this camera, and I've got a manual adapter for it somewhere. If I can find it, I'll pop it on here and include that. And if someone is interested in this camera, I can supply it with this camera here has a 35mm f2.8 lens. I think I've got a 28mm lens, and I've also got a 50mm f1.4, so I can make it available with any of those lenses. So if you're interested, check out my online stores. I'll have it up in a few days. And if you're looking for anything else, of course, please check them out. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you tune in again soon.